This is Jus Cogens, the international law podcast from Leiden. My name is Omar Akif, and on this show we discuss the latest from the world of international law with leading scholars and practitioners. Welcome to another episode of the Jus Cogens podcast. This week we'll be talking about state violence against Rohingyas in Myanmar, as reported by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we'll specifically talk about how hate speech and ethnically motivated content on social media platforms has aggravated the issue further. We'll talk about how international accountability mechanisms can and do regulate insightful content on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And joining us today to discuss this is Dr. Emma Irving, who is an assistant professor of public international law at the Croce Center for International Legal Studies at Leiden University. She currently researches on international law responses to the use of modern communication technology in conflict. She tweets at eIrving, and thank you so much, Professor Irving, for joining us today on the podcast. So before we get started with the main discussion on the report and the issue in general, Dr. Irving, can you give us a brief overview of how Facebook and other social media platforms are potentially involved or complicit in furthering the cause of the state violence against the Rohingyas by the Myanmar army?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I think that this podcast is a great idea, and I look forward to listening to all of your episodes to come. So thank you for involving me. So I think what's important maybe to make clear at the outset is that Facebook itself isn't necessarily complicit in what's been going on in Myanmar. But it's interesting because what we have here is an example of a piece of technology, an internet platform that can be used for a range of different purposes, and the reasons why it was created are positive. To allow people to express themselves, to share ideas and to share opinions, and this platform, this piece of technology is being turned to very unfortunate uses in certain contexts. And it's not only Myanmar, we also see this in Sri Lanka as well, where there's a lot of Facebook-fueled violence happening in that country as well. So what we see in Myanmar particularly, and reports started to come out about this in probably about April of this year, as studies were being done, that showed a significant spike in hate speech coming out through social media, particularly Facebook, in the Myanmar context, in the lead up to September 2017, when the most recent outbreak of violence against Rohingya took place. So we see a lot on Facebook, posts relating to calling the Rohingya people and other ethnic minorities, comparing them to animals, comparing them to illegal immigrants. And some of the content is really quite abhorrent. There's very detailed report of a lot of the content in the extensive report that was released on Tuesday, which is the 18th of September 2018, that details some of the actual things that were said on Facebook against the Rohingya people. And I think it's interesting because you see it being used by different groups. You see it being used specifically by nationalist groups who are spreading hate speech, incitement, but also a lot of misinformation. And then you see it being used by the military as well. So the military is very active on Facebook. It's in Myanmar, Facebook is one of the main ways that the military distributes news and updates on its activities to the population. So it's much more common to see the military reporting its activities on Facebook than it is to see it through other forms of media. At least that's the conclusion that's been reached by the fact-finding mission on Myanmar, from the OHCHR. So you see these two uses. You see on the one hand nationalist groups using it to spread hateful speech, inciting speech and misinformation, and then you see it being used by the military to give updates on military activities, but also the military is mirroring the nationalist rhetoric that's coming out of these nationalist Facebook groups as well.
Okay, and before we go into the specifics of the report and what it says, how do you see the responsibility of social media platforms like Facebook in general to suppress the incitement of violence under international law or other sources?
So that's a very difficult question. I think it's quite easy to read the fact-finding report and understand the role of social media in Myanmar. It's very difficult to take a step from that to understanding any kind of responsibility that social media companies might have. I think it will be easy to establish individual criminal responsibility, at least in theory, if not maybe not so much in practice, it will be easy to establish that for the individuals who are using Facebook in order to spread hate speech and incitement. But the role of the social media companies themselves, that's the real challenge, I think, that we see when it comes to Facebook's involvement in Myanmar, but also in places like Sri Lanka. And even in Europe as well, we see a lot of spikes in Facebook use and hate speech on Facebook in relation to violence against refugees as well. So it's not confined to Myanmar. So under international law, there's not really a framework that imposes any kind of legal obligations on social media companies. Social media companies are, at the end of the day, domestic legal entities. And even though there's a movement within international law towards including different kinds of subjects of international law, and we see this in relation to individuals, for example, with international criminal law. So even though we have this push and we are talking about corporate responsibility, as yet companies, domestic companies, are not subjects of international law. So we can't speak about obligations that they might have or responsibilities that they might have under international law. What we can perhaps speak about a little bit is the fact that these social media companies seem to be acknowledging a responsibility that they hold themselves. So it's not necessarily a legal responsibility that they're acknowledging, but Facebook in particular has come out quite a lot recently and discussed how they failed in their responsibility. So they're using a lot of this language in their press releases and in their the hearings that they've been going through in the US, about how they have a responsibility towards the people who use Facebook, how they have a responsibility to communities to make sure that Facebook isn't used in a way that leads to violence and spreads hate. So they're using the language of responsibility, and from that you can maybe infer that they might be considering a kind of self-imposed obligation, that maybe they're imposing some kind of restrictions and limitations on themselves, so that would be a sort of form of self-regulation. But as yet, there's no international legal framework that we can turn to. And this is exactly the problem that people are having in the field of business and human rights generally. I mean, this is a subsection of that there are voluntary codes of conduct, but there's no legal obligation. And indeed, social media companies have made a code of conduct with the European Union in which they undertake to remove hateful and unlawful speech from Facebook, Facebook and the other social media companies involved, such as Twitter and YouTube. They undertake in this code of conduct to remove that kind of content as soon as possible. But again, it's a voluntary thing. It's not a legal obligation.
You talk about Facebook's response to these allegations, and you also refer to them in your article that they claim that they were too slow to act, and they're developing new technology to get rid of hate speech from their platforms. And they have also removed the profiles of top military leaders of the Myanmar army, also removed some pages who were promoting ethnically motivated speech. Do you feel that it was more of a reactive response to the allegations, or do they have a clear and structured policy of regulating hate speech and ethnic content on their platforms?
I think, unfortunately, in Myanmar, this has been a very reactive stance that Facebook has taken. And you do see that from their response. They admit we were too slow to act. And when you go into the fact-finding mission's report, it details in longer reports how Facebook was ineffective in its response. There's one particularly troubling report in this longer report of the fact-finding mission, where they describe how they used Facebook's reporting system. So when you see a post on Facebook, there's always a button that says, do you want to report this post? And that's a way of indicating to Facebook that a post might be problematic. So the fact-finding mission did this several times with several very problematic and hateful posts that they saw on Facebook. They tried reporting them. And every time that they tried, after a long period of time, they got a message back saying that the post in question did not violate Facebook's community standards, which when you read the post in question is quite shocking because it's clearly very hateful and clearly unlawful in that sense. But Facebook's response was to say that it didn't violate its community standards. And the report goes on to describe how, in the end, they did manage to get that piece of speech taken down, but much later, and after the individual who was the subject of the hateful speech had been continued to be threatened and had to go into hiding, the only way that they managed to get the post down was to go through a contact that someone had at Facebook, not through the official reporting mechanism. So Facebook's really failed here. They failed in their reporting mechanisms. They've also failed to dialogue properly with the government structures in Myanmar to communicate to them how they should have been using their service. And you see the same criticism coming out of Sri Lanka as well. The government officials in Sri Lanka tried to dialogue with Facebook, tried to ask for Facebook's help to control the hate speech that we saw coming out in Sri Lanka that was leading to all this violence. And Facebook was very slow to react there as well. So there's really a problem here that Facebook is waiting until it's too late. And hopefully it won't take another genocide of this type for Facebook to start taking its responsibility seriously. It's a difficult thing to do. It's got a lot of work to do. But it does need to carry through on this rhetoric that it's using of responsibility.
As you mentioned in your article as well, that Facebook was unwilling to share data of those profiles with the fact-finding mission, and they refused to acknowledge they did not comment on this aspect of the report in their response when they said that they're too slow to act, but they did not shed any light on whether why they were not sharing the data with the fact-finding mission report. How do you see that? What could be the reasons for that?
In terms of reasons, I mean, it would be speculation for me to say because I don't have any kind of insight into it. But again, it's something that you see when I wrote this post for Opinion Juris. I wrote it based on the shorter report that came out on the 27th of August. We've since had the longer report that came out on the 18th of September. And that one goes into more detail, indeed, again, and reiterates this point that Facebook wasn't willing to share country-specific data, meaning that Facebook wasn't willing to share data about the use of its services that was specific to Myanmar. It shared some data, but not country-specific data. Facebook is well known for being very problematic in this respect. They're quite closed, they're unwilling to share certain things. There's this new initiative amongst a number of social media companies over the last few years to release what's called a transparency report, where they highlight how many requests they've had to remove accounts and to take down content, and where they share how many times they either complied with those requests or refused. But that doesn't give you enough information to get a full picture about what happens in Myanmar and in other similar situations. And I think that is a criticism that Facebook needs to address. And in the longer reports, the report makes a number of recommendations of what it thinks of what the mission thinks that Facebook should do in the future to improve. And that includes, indeed, sharing data with international accountability mechanisms where appropriate. But also, very interestingly, the report specifically states that where content has been removed, so if there was a problematic instance of hate speech and Facebook did remove it, that Facebook should keep the data about that post indefinitely, and should hand it over to an international or a domestic court that wishes to conduct a prosecution. So this is an extra responsibility that the fact-finding mission is placing on Facebook in relation to sharing data that is no longer publicly available because it was part of a post that's since been removed.
And I guess that Facebook has also acknowledged that it keeps the data of many of the accounts that are being deleted, which is perhaps a change from the previous approach to some extent. And even many organizations who are just documenting the conflicts, their accounts are being deleted as well. And they're claiming that most of the data is not available or has been removed, and they haven't gotten any coherent response from Facebook as to what happened to the data. But there's serious implications regarding to accountability in this regard. Do you think that these social media platforms should have an independent monitoring mechanism in terms of if they're deleting or blocking certain accounts? Should they share that data should be independently reviewed as well? I know it has serious privacy and data protection implications. and it's not as simple as just sharing data, making it public, or sharing it with the UN or the OHCHR. But do you think that there's any feasible mechanism to get around this problem of data sharing?
That's another really great question, and it's one of the bigger questions that we will have to think very seriously about as we move forward into this social media age, and an age where conflict is increasingly digital. We need to have a way of dealing with this. And what's good about Facebook's response to the report of the fact-finding mission is that they have come out and said that the accounts and pages and profiles that they've taken down since the 27th of August, that they're keeping all of the data associated with those accounts. So that is definitely a step in the right direction, that data is being preserved. And Facebook, being a tech company, is hopefully, I'm sure, doing that in a way that that maintains the integrity of the data also. But you touch on an interesting point, because this openness of Facebook with respect to the fact that it's keeping the data of removed accounts, this is a new development, because in the summer of 2017, we saw these mass takedowns of content that you're referring to, a lot of them particularly to do with content relating to Syria. So we had organizations, non-governmental organizations, that were using the platforms such as YouTube and Facebook and Twitter to store a lot of their videos that they were collecting in their documentation efforts, and also to share those videos. And storing that amount of content, all of those videos, it costs a lot of money because you need a lot of storage space. So it's not always possible for these small NGOs to do that themselves, so they rely on the social media platform. And then in the summer of last year, there was this mass takedown, and all of this content was lost because it was deemed to be terrorist content and violent content. And no appreciation was given to the fact that, yes, it was documenting a violent event, but the content wasn't put up for violent purposes, it was for documentation purposes. And with respect to that content, it hasn't been made clear by Facebook what has happened to it. Even now, as you say, you've got organizations that are trying to get their content back. Google has been a little bit more forthcoming and a little bit more helpful with respect to YouTube and the videos taken down by YouTube. But Facebook has not been very forthcoming or helpful in helping organizations to get their content back. So this is definitely a step in the right direction. Whether we can have a monitoring mechanism that would help navigate this particular minefield, I think that's a really great question. I do think indeed you're going to run up against many problems to do with data security and data protection, but also privacy, freedom of expression. Because would you use this mechanism only for this kind of context, where you're looking at accountability for atrocities, or are you also looking at it when it comes to fake news? Are we also looking at it when it comes to terrorist speech? So there would be a lot of things that we'd have to think about, but we do need some kind of movement one way or the other, because I don't think that we can leave it entirely up to social media companies, particularly when they fall so completely out of any regulatory framework that can meaningfully control them. The sense that we don't have an international legal framework that applies. And domestic law, of course, does apply, but it's very tricky because of the transboundary nature of the internet. It's very difficult to regulate these kinds of things at the domestic level only, especially if you're not doing it in a concerted way where states are cooperating with each other. So I do think that a monitoring mechanism would be an interesting thing to explore, because data and information that Facebook is perhaps not willing to share with the world at large, possibly for legitimate reasons, maybe they would be willing to share with an independent body that could look at it impartially and not sell their trade secrets or not share other people's data and so on. So I think it's an interesting idea, and I think we'll have to play around with a number of different ideas.
Yeah, that's right. And if we move slightly towards a different area in terms of the evidence which is gathered from these open source channels, as they're also called, what sort of standard of proof is required for any evidence which is admitted through these platforms? Because we know there is a lot of propaganda material, there's a lot of misrepresentation of factual information. So it becomes very difficult to verify any information which is of any factual nature if it is to be used in a court of law. And I think you have also mentioned that previously there have been instances where information has been used from social media in cases. I think which comes to mind is of the arrest warrant, which was based on the videos obtained from social media, and the I'm forgetting the name. I think it was Verfali in Al-Fali of Libya, and also OPCW's fact-finding mission report in Syria, which relied upon information gathered through social media. And I think there was a case of a Swedish court which convicted a Syrian national of war crimes based on evidence posted on Facebook. So my question is that, do you think that international accountability mechanisms which are regulating and dealing with social media, if they are they moving in the right direction? And how would you like to see them evolve in terms of dealing with evidence? I know it's a very loaded and broad question. You can tackle it however you want.
Yeah, definitely a very detailed question, a very broad question covering a number of different areas. I think starting with the standard of evidence question, that really depends on the international accountability mechanism in question. So if we understand international accountability mechanisms to be fact-finding bodies, commissions of inquiry, and international criminal courts and tribunals, the standards that they're going to be using are very different. So a fact-finding body might use the standard of reasonable grounds to believe, whereas to convict before an international court, it has to be beyond all reasonable doubt. And I think that does really play a role in how this kind of information is approached and what kind of verification procedures it's put through. What's good to note about the fact-finding mission report on Myanmar is that it makes clear that even though it's relied on open sources in its investigation, it hasn't included anything that it hasn't been able to verify and corroborate. So it's not only relying on Facebook for its information. Based on the report, it seems to be that it's using Facebook, but then it's confirming that with other sources. And that's really key. When you're using open source material and you're using that to inform your investigations, or if you're putting that forward as evidence before a court, it has to be properly approached and verified and corroborated. You can't just use it and assume that it's true. And you see this also with respect to the Al-Wafali videos. The Al-Wafali videos, there are 7 videos upon which the Al-Wafali arrest warrant is based. And for each of those videos, there is witness testimony to support the identification of Al-Wafali as the person in the video. And the ICC commissioned reports from experts in video analysis to confirm that these videos met the standards necessary at that stage in proceedings. So you always have to go through these procedures when you're using open source. And this will become even more important when we start to get into the territory of deep fakes. So this is going to become more of a problem as we get fakes on the internet that are more and more convincing. And it's harder and harder to tell a true video from a fake video just because our technological advancement is getting so good. In terms of how I'd like to see it evolve, I think we are heading in a good direction, but we are heading there slowly. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a bad thing, because we need to be sure that we're on the right road and that we're not using this material in a way that's irresponsible and that points the finger in the wrong places. But also particularly if you're using it for fact-finding reasons, this is an important part of setting the historical record. If we're going to look at the fact-finding report on Myanmar 50 years from now as an authoritative report of what happens in that time, we need to make sure we base it on appropriate content. So then caution is good. On the other hand, you do often encounter fear of the technology from judges and lawyers who don't really understand it. And I understand where they're coming from. It's a tricky thing, but I would like to see open-mindedness and willingness to learn and willingness to take on new types of information and to explore the opportunities that they give us, while always being cautious. That's what I would encourage people working in international.
And I guess that's the only way the law can develop in this area, because there are a lot of uncertainties regarding how to regulate the social media companies and the evidence gathered through them. So they will have to experiment I guess maybe be open to new ideas, as you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and coming to the recent statement by ICC Prosecutor Ms. Fatou Bensouda on 18th of September, she just came out with a statement just 2 days back. So it talks about opening a preliminary examination concerning the alleged deportation of Rohingya people from Myanmar and also investigating crimes against humanity. But this specifically in relation to the deportation of the people to Bangladesh, since the latter, Bangladesh is a party to the ICC and Myanmar is not. It's not an investigation, but examining available information to decide whether to investigate or not. And the statement also says that they will be engaging with national authorities as well. Just a quick comment on the basis of where do you see this is going, and how important would be the information obtained from social media in these proceedings, because this is just a preliminary examination, and when the proceedings go into the next stage, all of the evidence would become very important. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
I think in this context, with the ICC preliminary examination, open source evidence is going to be absolutely crucial. There's very little access to Myanmar, and we see this also. That's part of the reason that the fact-finding report relies so much on open source material, is because they didn't have access to Myanmar, and it will be the same for the ICC most likely. And a lot of the preliminary examination stuff is done from here, from offices in The Hague. So a lot of it is, digital investigations and looking at things online. So I think it will be absolutely crucial in establishing at the early stages whether there is grounds to proceed further and to maybe proceed to an investigation and potentially to the arrest warrant phase. And then, of course, as you get later on in the process and you start indicating particular individuals that you might want to talk to and that you might want to interview and potentially arrest, there you can start to see other sources of information becoming equally as important as open source. But at this early stage, I think it will be very important. Beyond open source, with respect to Myanmar, what's been interesting is the use of satellite imagery. And you do also see this in the fact-finding mission report as well. And you saw it back in August and September of 2017, when lots of news outlets and reporting on the events in Myanmar used satellite imagery to show the before and after pictures, which showed the destruction of Rohingya villages. So you've got the picture where the village is there, and then you've got the picture where the village is gone. So I think it's not only open source, but that kind of evidence will also be crucial in a country where there's no ground access at the moment.
And naturally, we'll require some legal framework to regulate that as well. Because as you said, that information from these open source channels would be of immense importance to the proceedings as the preliminary examination takes place, and then possibly an investigation and a trial that might happen. Recently, in part of this investigation, there was a post by the commander-in-chief of the Myanmar army, which directly alludes to the pre-planned nature and purpose of the operations, which is an important consideration in establishing criminal responsibility, and also supports the mission's finding genocidal intent. And I guess that's the only information which has been expressed in the report in terms of establishing genocidal intent of these operations. Given the immense importance and value of such information in these investigations and subsequent criminal proceedings, don't you think there's a dire need of a comprehensive international framework and legal mechanism to use such information in trials, and how to regulate the companies and how do social media companies fit into this? This is the final question, so you can take your time.
That would be great. I think we should definitely develop an international framework that we all agree on in how to deal with these things. Work is being done by a number of people around the world who are doing a fantastic job of putting together guidelines on how we should use open source material at the international level and at the domestic level. Great research being done on how to use digital evidence and its limitations and the roles that it can play. I think over the next couple of years, we're going to start to see some really great thinking on this being published, because of course now everyone is busy behind their computers trying to find answers to these questions that are hitting us quicker than we can respond to them. And developments are happening so quickly. I think it would be useful to have an international consensus on how to approach this, particularly in relation to international crimes, and particularly given the relevance that it can have, as you say, for things like genocidal intent, which are incredibly difficult to prove. And it's not the case that you should take one Facebook post and then say, okay, well, on the basis of this post, there was genocidal intent. But what's interesting again about this fact-finding report is it goes further than that. It not only relies on social media posts such as from Facebook to establish genocidal intent, though it does use other sources of information to inform that. It also uses Facebook posts to establish command responsibility and to show that the commanders of the Myanmar army did know what was going on based on the posts that they were putting on Facebook. And that's the interesting thing about the Swedish case, is that the role of Facebook in one of the cases in Sweden wasn't that there was a photo of a beheading or a photo of a killing or a video. It's that the people in question had been posting on Facebook what they were doing, and on the basis of that, the judges found there to be a timeline of events. So they relied on that to say, well, you captured this person at this time, and then you transported them to a village at this time, and then you executed it at this time. And that time frame was too small for you to have given them a fair trial. So you see Facebook posts being used for a range of different purposes. And because of all these different purposes, and because of the importance that it can play, having some kind of international agreement, some kind of international framework would be really helpful to make sure we're all on the same page, to make sure we're all approaching this kind of content in a responsible and appropriate manner, but also in a way that maximizes its utility, that we're not scared of this content and we're not hiding from it because it might be too difficult to work with.
Oh, well said. And finally, which international legal regime, you see it most likely to happen in this consensus of sorts? Is it criminal law? Is it human rights law? Is it national domestic law? Because this is just one example of technology playing its part, and it's only going to increase in the future. We'll have newer technologies and we'll have to regulate them as well. Since your research is focused on this particular area, in your expert opinion, where do you see this heading off to?
I think there are two areas where we'll see developments. I think on the one hand, at the domestic level, we'll see a lot of development just because they're dealing with cases faster than the international level can. So criminal proceedings at the domestic level, for example, these in Sweden and Germany that are carried out under universal jurisdiction laws a lot of the time, they happen much quickly, the investigation's quicker, the prosecution's quicker, so practice develops much more quickly at the domestic level than it does at the international one. So in that sense, I think we'll see a lot of trial and error at the domestic level, which can help give us an understanding of best practices, of how we should be approaching this. I think the thinking work, the big picture research and thinking about how to approach the use of open source material in accountability efforts will happen more at the international level. You see a lot of dialogue between different international accountability mechanisms, judges from the ICC, for example, talking about open source, or you might hear from academics that work in close cooperation with international accountability mechanisms, or people who work in fact-finding missions or at the OHCHR. I think the synthesizing work of how we should bring all these things together, that will happen at the international level. But the quickly developing practice at the domestic level will be crucial in informing the discussion at the international level.
Dr. Emma Irving, thank you so much for being on the Jus Cogens podcast.
Thank you for
It was an
having me.
absolute pleasure. You can follow her at
Irving NL.
And you can also follow us at JC Law Podcast on Twitter for listening to this particular podcast and other developments from international law. That's all we have for today.